August 17, 1943. The morning sky over Germany was blue, clear, almost serene. But within hours, it would be filled with fire, smoke, and the falling wreckage of American bombers. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses thundered eastward, engines pounding, each one carrying its deadly cargo toward Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The target, ball-bearing factories and aircraft plants, the lifeblood of Hitler's war machine. The plan was daring, the risk enormous, and the weakness was glaring. These bombers had no long-range escort. They would fly alone into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. Soon, the horizon darkened with German fighters. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf 190s. Squadrons of sleek, deadly predators rushing to meet the lumbering bombers. They struck with merciless precision. In tight spirals, they tore through the formations, cannon shells ripping into wings and engines. Explosions blossomed in the sky. One after another, flying fortresses vanished in clouds of flame. By day's end, more than 60 bombers were gone. Hundreds of young American airmen were dead or captured. It was a catastrophe so great that commanders knew at once. Without proper escort fighters, daylight bombing could not survive. But the only new escort fighter the Americans had ready for large-scale deployment was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. And to many pilots, on both sides of the channel, the P-47 was a joke. Too big. Too heavy. Too slow to turn with the Luftwaffe's nimble fighters. The Germans, veterans of years of aerial duels, laughed when they heard about the new American Jug. How could such a lumbering beast challenge the knife-edge agility of their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs? Even American crews whispered doubts. When they strapped themselves into its wide cockpit, looking out across its massive engine cowling, some wondered if they'd been given a flying anvil rather than a fighter. But what they did not yet understand, what the Germans would soon discover to their horror, was that this heavy fighter carried a secret. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. 8 barrels of raw, concentrated firepower that, when unleashed in unison, could turn a sleek enemy fighter into a heap of burning metal in seconds. The same weight that made the Thunderbolt seem unwieldy also made it tough. Its armor could shrug off hits that would rip a Spitfire or Mustang apart. Its engine could keep running long after absorbing enemy fire. And in a dive, this so-called flying tank could outpace almost anything in the sky. The Luftwaffe may have laughed at the Thunderbolt. But soon they would not be laughing. They would be running. This is the story of how an aircraft mocked as too heavy to fight became the hammer that broke the Luftwaffe's back. Stay with me, and if you want to hear more untold stories of the Second World War, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. That way you'll never miss the next journey into history's most dramatic battles. England, 1942. The rolling countryside of East Anglia no longer belonged to sheep and farmers. Overnight, it had become a fortress of concrete and steel. Runways stretched like scars across fields once dotted with hedgerows. Wooden huts and metal Nissen shelters housed thousands of young Americans, boys who had crossed the ocean with wide eyes and heavy hearts. The locals called them Yanks. The Germans called them invaders in waiting. From these airfields, the United States Army Air Forces promised to launch a new kind of war. Unlike the Royal Air Force, which had turned to night raids after suffering unbearable losses in daylight, the Americans swore they could cripple Hitler's empire by bombing factories, rail yards, and oil refineries in broad daylight. Precision, not terror, would be their weapon. The idea was bold. Some called it arrogance. But theory met brutal reality. B-17s and B-24s might have bristled with defensive guns, but over occupied Europe, without escort, they were slow, fat targets. Each mission without fighter cover turned into a grim lottery of survival. The Luftwaffe, with its veteran pilots and ruthless discipline, carved entire bomber formations out of the sky. The numbers were staggering. On one mission, nearly a quarter of the attacking force could be lost in a single day. Back home in America, telegrams piled up in mailboxes, each beginning with the dreaded line, "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you." Clearly, something had to change. The solution seemed obvious: long-range escort fighters. Agile, deadly, and with the endurance to follow bombers deep into the Reich. But here was the problem. The aircraft America had at hand were either not ready or not trusted. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning had impressive speed and range, but in Europe's cold skies, its engines often failed. The lighter P-39 Airacobra never stood a chance. And that left the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft that looked nothing like what most imagined a fighter should be. The Thunderbolt was massive, towering over ground crews. Fully loaded, it weighed in at over 10,000 pounds, more than double the weight of a Spitfire. Its nose was dominated by the great round bulk of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a monster of a radial engine that drank fuel but delivered brute power. From a distance, it seemed less a duelist's rapier and more a blacksmith's hammer. Many doubted it could ever fight the Luftwaffe. German pilots sneered. American pilots grumbled. British observers raised their eyebrows at what looked like an overweight brute. A fighter, after all, was supposed to be sleek, nimble, quick on the stick. The Thunderbolt was none of these, at least not at first glance. But buried beneath its bulk were qualities no one could dismiss forever. Its cockpit, roomy and armored, gave pilots a chance to live when enemy fire tore through the fuselage. Its engine, rugged and redundant, could absorb punishment and still drag the fighter home. And most terrifying of all, mounted in its wings, were 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns. Each one capable of spitting out bullets the size of a man's thumb at blistering speed. Together, they formed a wall of fire that no German fighter could laugh at for long. Yet in late 1942 and early 1943, those strengths were not yet legend. They were buried under doubt. American squadrons trained in the new fighter but felt uneasy. Could this overweight machine dance with the experienced German aces who had honed their craft since the Spanish Civil War? Could it climb fast enough to meet incoming threats? Could it turn tight enough to survive in a dogfight? Imagine being a 21-year-old lieutenant, strapping into the cockpit for your first mission over Europe. You'd heard the rumors. You'd read the grim mission reports. You knew the enemy you were about to face had hundreds of kills between them. And then you looked down at the Thunderbolt's heavy frame and wondered, is this the machine that's supposed to keep me alive? The Thunderbolt began its combat service under this cloud of skepticism. To some, it was already a failure. To others, a desperate gamble. But wars are not won by first impressions. They are won in the crucible of combat. And it would not take long for the P-47 to begin showing a side of itself no one expected. Because while the Luftwaffe may have laughed at its bulk, they had not yet faced what happened when its 8 machine guns lit the sky. Spring 1943. The first American squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts crossed the Channel into occupied Europe. Their mission was simple in concept but terrifying in practice: to protect the heavy bombers as far as their fuel would allow. On the ground, German spotters reported something strange. A new type of fighter had appeared in the skies over France. Sleek? Hardly. Elegant? Not at all. To Luftwaffe eyes, the Thunderbolt looked ridiculous, fat-bellied, blunt-nosed, with wings too wide and a frame too tall. Many German pilots laughed. They compared it to a milk jug. Soon the nickname Jug spread from American crews to their enemies as well. But in war, mockery is a dangerous substitute for caution. The Thunderbolt's first combat sweeps were tentative. American pilots stayed close to the bombers, nervous about straying too far into hostile skies. Encounters with the Luftwaffe were brief, often ending with Thunderbolts diving away rather than turning into dogfights. Some critics in London and Washington nodded knowingly. See, they said, too heavy, too slow. Yet every time a P-47 returned riddled with bullets but still flying, ground crews began to suspect there was more to this machine. Other fighters, Spitfires, Hurricanes, even P-38s, might limp home, but a Thunderbolt often thundered back with holes the size of a man's fist in its fuselage, still refusing to die. The real turning point came when American pilots learned to trust the Jug's greatest secret: its dive. German fighters like the Bf-109 excelled at climbing, twisting, and turning. But when a Thunderbolt rolled over and pointed its nose downward, gravity and horsepower combined into something ferocious. The Jug could dive faster than almost anything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. A German ace who clung too long to a Thunderbolt in a dive risked his wings tearing off in the attempt to follow. And then there were the guns. 8.50 caliber Brownings lined up in the wings like a row of cannons. When a pilot squeezed the trigger, the Jug unleashed nearly 100 rounds per second. Each round could shred aluminum, tear through engines, or ignite fuel tanks. Together, they formed a storm of fire so dense that even a split-second burst was often fatal. One American pilot later recalled his first kill. I pressed the trigger and the whole sky in front of me seemed to flash. When the smoke cleared, the German was gone. just gone. Word spread quickly through Luftwaffe squadrons. Don't underestimate the Jug. Those who had laughed soon learned that closing head-on with a Thunderbolt could mean instant death. By the summer of 1943, P-47s were racking up kills. They were not yet perfect. Their range still limited how far they could escort bombers, but the myth of the overweight, useless fighter was beginning to crack. American pilots, once unsure, now flew with more confidence. They discovered that their machine, while not a ballerina, was a brawler, a pugilist that took hits, gave them back harder, and survived. The Luftwaffe still held the initiative in many battles. The losses to bombers remained heavy. But the air war was beginning to change. The Thunderbolt was proving it could fight, and, perhaps more importantly, proving that German laughter would not last. By late summer 1943, American pilots were beginning to see the Thunderbolt differently. The initial jitters of flying an aircraft mocked as a flying milk jug gave way to curiosity, and then to respect. Combat had a way of stripping illusions, and the Jug was proving it was no clumsy brute, but a fighter with its own unique rhythm. The first lesson pilots learned was simple: don't dogfight like a Spitfire. Many new arrivals from stateside training instinctively tried to turn with German fighters. In those twisting spirals, the nimble Bf-109s and Fw-190s always had the edge. Pilots who insisted on matching the Luftwaffe in that dance often paid with their lives. But veteran Jug pilots soon began preaching a new doctrine: boom and zoom. Climb high. Spot your prey. Then dive with all the fury of gravity and horsepower combined. Hit fast. Hit hard. And climb away before the enemy can react. The Thunderbolt was too heavy for tight knife fights, but as a hammer in the sky, it was unmatched. The second lesson was endurance. A Messerschmitt might outturn the Jug, but few German planes could withstand punishment like the Thunderbolt could. Time and again, American pilots limped home with holes stitched across their wings, chunks of fuselage missing, oil leaking from engines. The Jug just kept flying. Stories circulated of aircraft returning with cylinders shot out, tails shredded, or cockpits half blown open, yet still landing safely in England. One pilot, badly shaken after limping home in a riddled Jug, told his crew chief, "If I'd been in anything else, I'd be a prisoner in Germany right now." The third lesson was firepower. The 8.50 caliber Brownings were not just a weapon, they were a statement. Each time a Thunderbolt squadron caught German fighters in their sights, the results were devastating. Luftwaffe pilots who had once laughed began to fear that storm of bullets. German bombers, too, stood little chance against such concentrated fire. One well-placed burst could rip an Heinkel or Dornier apart in midair. American squadrons started pushing deeper into enemy skies. The P-47 still lacked the range to follow bombers all the way to their targets in central Germany, but on the fringes, over France, the Low Countries and the Channel, it began to dominate. The Luftwaffe had grown used to attacking bombers without serious interference. Now, every time they swooped in, a pack of Thunderbolts was waiting. There was also the psychological shift. American airmen who once doubted the Jug now felt protected inside its armored shell. Confidence is contagious. Squadrons that once hesitated began to attack boldly, certain their aircraft could take them into a fight and bring them home again. And confidence, in war, often proves as lethal as any bullet. For the Germans, this shift was disconcerting. The enemy they had mocked was adapting quickly, learning how to exploit its machine strengths. The laughter faded. In its place came grudging respect, and, eventually, fear. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe still controlled much of the daylight skies over Germany. But the tide was beginning to turn. The Jug was no longer an object of ridicule. It was becoming something the Germans could not ignore, a predator, one that fought on its own terms. The stage was set for the Thunderbolt's next evolution, when American commanders realized this heavy fighter could do more than escort. It could hunt. By early 1944, something remarkable had happened. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once derided as too heavy, too sluggish, was no longer simply playing bodyguard to bombers. It was becoming a predator in its own right. The shift came from necessity. The Luftwaffe was still fierce and the bombers still vulnerable. Escort duty mattered, but commanders realized that if the Jug could take the fight to the Germans before they ever reached the bomber streams, the air war could change dramatically. And so, Thunderbolt squadrons began flying fighter sweeps. Instead of waiting passively for German interceptors, they crossed the channel with one mission: hunt. Their targets were not only enemy fighters but also airfields, supply lines, and anything that moved on the ground. The Thunderbolt was uniquely suited to this new role. Its rugged frame could carry bombs and rockets in addition to its 8.50 caliber guns. Few German vehicles, trains, or convoys survived a Jug's attention. When pilots thundered down low, strafing with hundreds of rounds per second, the countryside erupted in fire. German soldiers on the ground quickly learned to scatter at the first sight of that broad silhouette overhead. But even in the skies, the Jug proved it could stalk and kill. Pilots discovered that by climbing high and using the boom and zoom tactic, they could dictate the terms of engagement. A formation of Thunderbolts diving from altitude was a terrifying sight. The Germans called these attacks anvils falling from the sky. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin, could not afford these constant losses. By 1944, their veteran aces were dwindling and replacements lacked experience. Against the Thunderbolt's volume of fire, inexperience was fatal. One German pilot who survived an engagement reportedly admitted, "We thought it was too heavy to fight. But when the shooting started, we learned it was too heavy to kill." Psychologically, the tables had turned. Only months earlier, it had been the Americans doubting their machine, whispering that it wasn't good enough. Now, it was German pilots dreading the sight of a Jug squadron diving from above, their cannons spitting fire before climbing back into the clouds. The P-47's reputation began to soar. Pilots returning to their bases told stories of German fighters disintegrating under a single burst, of armored trains torn apart by rockets, of tanks abandoned after strafing runs. The Jug was no longer just a flying tank, it was becoming a symbol of American firepower unleashed. The Luftwaffe, once masters of the European sky, were being dragged into a war of attrition they could not win. Every day, more of their precious aircraft and veteran pilots fell to the Jug's guns. Every week, the balance shifted further toward the Allies. And behind it all, the laughter was gone. Where once the Germans had scoffed at the overweight newcomer, they now faced it with caution, or not at all. Some German squadrons avoided combat altogether if Thunderbolts were near. What had begun as a joke had become a nightmare. By the spring of 1944, the Jug was no longer just an escort, no longer a question mark. It was a hunter. And the Luftwaffe's days of dominance were numbered. By the spring of 1944, the war in the air had shifted. The once mighty Luftwaffe, stretched thin from the Eastern Front to the Mediterranean, was bleeding pilots and machines faster than it could replace them. And in the West, the P-47 Thunderbolt was one of the reasons why. Nowhere was this clearer than in the months leading up to Operation Overlord, D-Day. The Allies knew that for the invasion of France to succeed, they had to control the skies. German reinforcements, tanks, and trains had to be crippled before they ever reached the beaches. And the job of bludgeoning the Reich's transport arteries fell heavily to the Thunderbolt. The Jug had grown into its nickname. Its bulk, once ridiculed, became an advantage. Those broad wings carried bombs, rockets, and drop tanks that extended its reach. Squadrons roared over northern France, strafing trains, smashing convoys, and pummeling radar stations. Villagers in occupied towns learned to cheer when they saw the massive fighters overhead, not because they were beautiful but because they meant the Germans were suffering. For ground troops, the sight of a Thunderbolt diving low was unforgettable. The whistle of its engine, the thunder of its guns, the eruption of earth and steel when its bombs struck, it was as though the sky itself had turned into a weapon. German commanders dreaded the phrase J-bows, their nickname for Allied fighter bombers. And among those J-bows the Jug was king. But the Jug's role didn't stop on the ground. High above the channel, P-47s swept the skies clean. Escorting bombers deeper and deeper into enemy territory, they clashed with what remained of the Luftwaffe. The once confident German pilots who had mocked the Jug now found themselves on the defensive, diving for cover as swarms of American fighters fell upon them. The contrast was stark. In 1943, the Luftwaffe had laughed at the overweight intruder. By June 1944, they were broken by it. Entire bomber formations crossed into France with Thunderbolts as their shield, and losses plummeted. The great raids that once bled the 8th Air Force white were now striking their targets with devastating force, escorted every mile of the way by fighters the Germans had once dismissed. And then came June 6, 1944. As thousands of ships gathered in the Channel and Allied troops stormed the beaches, the Thunderbolt was there. From dawn to dusk, It prowled the skies over Normandy, shredding German columns racing toward the coast. Its rockets smashed tanks. Its guns turned trucks into twisted wrecks. Its bombs collapsed bridges, cutting off reinforcements. On D-Day and the weeks that followed, the Jug was everywhere. For the soldiers fighting on the ground, the Jug's presence was more than just tactical. It was psychological. One American infantryman later recalled, "Every time we saw a Jug overhead, we felt like the sky was on our side." For the Germans, the message was brutal and clear. The air no longer belonged to them. Their laughter had been silenced by thunder. By the summer of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had completed its transformation. It had gone from being the butt of jokes to the hammer of Allied air power. And with the skies secure, the path to Berlin was finally open. Summer 1944. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The front lines pushed inland. And above them, the sky thundered with American power. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. Squadrons scrambled from battered airfields, rushing to intercept Allied bombers and protect German troops. But every time they climbed, they found the same thing waiting: swarms of thunderbolts circling like hawks. The battles were brutal and brief. German pilots who once mocked the Jug now dreaded its silhouette. The moment 8.50 calibers opened fire, the air filled with glowing tracers and shattering metal. Entire formations could vanish in seconds. The statistics tell the story. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was losing hundreds of aircraft a week. Veteran pilots, irreplaceable, fell one after another. Replacements arrived with only a handful of hours in the cockpit. Against Jug squadrons they had no chance. And the Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter anymore. It was a destroyer of armies. Bridges crumbled under its bombs. Rail lines twisted in flames. Tanks, no matter how thick their armor, fell victim to its rockets. The Germans gave it a new reputation: the tank buster. Wherever it flew, retreat followed. The laughter of 1943 was long gone. Now fear. Imagine a German column moving at dawn, trucks, half-tracks, a few panzers rumbling toward the front. Suddenly the sky roars. Out of the sun, thunderbolts dive, guns blazing. In seconds the column is chaos, vehicles burning, men scattering, smoke rising into the morning air. Survivors crawl into ditches, cursing the very plane they once dismissed. American pilots began to feel it too. Confidence hardened into pride. They knew they were flying something indestructible. Something feared. Pilots who once doubted the Jug now wrote home with affection. Many gave their aircraft names: Little Chief, Big Ass Bird, Fiery Ginger. The Jug had become personal. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a partner, a shield, a weapon. The climax of this transformation came as the Allies surged across France. Every mile of advance was covered by thunderbolts. German attempts to regroup were smashed before they began. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was crumbling into memory. Short sentences. Sharp impact. The laughter had ended. The Jug had the last word. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a force but a shadow. The Reich's cities burned under Allied bombs. Its armies starved for supplies. And in the skies, the Thunderbolt reigned supreme. In less than 2 years, the P-47 had gone from a punchline to a legend. The irony was as heavy as the plane itself. Mocked for its weight, it had carried the weight of victory. The war in Europe was nearing its end. By 1945, the Luftwaffe that had once ruled the skies was shattered. Its airfields were bomb craters. Its aces were dead or captured. The thunder that roared above Germany now came not from Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs, but from the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. For the Americans, the Jug had become more than just a fighter. It was a symbol. A promise that the men flying into the heart of enemy territory would not be abandoned. A reassurance to ground troops that the skies belonged to them. And a warning to the Germans that their days of dominance were over. The statistics are staggering. Over 15,000 Thunderbolts were built. Together, they destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in the air, and tens of thousands of vehicles, trains, and tanks on the ground. No other Allied fighter could boast such versatility, escorting bombers one day, smashing rail lines the next. And yet, for all its power, the Jug was never the glamorous star. The P-51 Mustang would claim that mantle with its sleek lines and legendary range. The Mustang escorted bombers all the way to Berlin. The Mustang became the poster child of American air power. But ask the men who fought in 1943 and 1944. Ask the bomber crews who survived because a squadron of jugs dove into the enemy at just the right moment. Ask the infantrymen in Normandy who cheered when the broad silhouette swept low, its guns tearing German tanks to pieces. They will tell you, the Thunderbolt was the unsung hero. And perhaps that is fitting. The jug was never about beauty. It was never about elegance. It was about survival. It was about overwhelming firepower. It was about taking a punch and throwing one back twice as hard. German pilots once laughed at it. They joked that it was too heavy, too slow. But in the end, their laughter was drowned out by the roar of 8 machine guns. The jug had written its answer in fire across the skies of Europe. What can we learn from this story today? That first impressions lie. That ridicule can hide truth. That sometimes the ungainly, the underestimated, the mocked, can become the decisive factor. The Thunderbolt teaches us that strength is not always graceful, and resilience is often more important than speed. Long after the war ended, Thunderbolts served across the world. In South America, in Asia, in post-war Europe. Their ruggedness kept them flying long after sleeker machines had retired. They became testaments to the idea that what works in war is not always what looks best on paper. Today, when one of the few surviving P-47s takes to the skies at an air show, the crowd hears the same deep roar that once shook German hearts. Veterans who look up see more than a plane. They see a memory, of fear, of hope, of victory. The laughter of German pilots has long since faded into history. What remains is the legacy of a machine that carried young Americans into battle and brought so many of them home again. The P-47 Thunderbolt. Too heavy to fight, they said. Too slow to matter, they said. But when its 8.50s tore through the Luftwaffe, when its dive split the sky, when its resilience turned doubt into dominance, the truth was undeniable. The jug was thunder. The jug was survival. The jug was victory. And that is how a fighter that began as a punchline ended as a legend. And as we look back on this remarkable story, I'd like to ask you, if you've enjoyed uncovering this forgotten chapter of the war, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and join our growing community of history enthusiasts. Your support helps us bring more of these hidden stories to life, stories that remind us how courage, innovation, and resilience can change the course of history. Because the past still speaks, and together we can make sure it's never forgotten.